You're listening to Reset. I'm your host, Sasha Ann Simons. Today we're bringing you a special election show in partnership with WBEZ's Prisoncast.
We're going to go to C-Pod.
The show is all about civic engagement from behind bars.
Does anybody want to register to vote?
We're starting inside Cook County Jail on Chicago's southwest side. There are many people in jail who aren't serving a sentence. They're still awaiting trial, so they still have the right to vote. It means that every election, parts of Cook County Jail transform into polling places where incarcerated voters cast their ballots. But first, they need to register.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jeremiah. I'm with Chicago Votes. We're here registering people to vote. So if you've never voted before, or if you've never registered, this would be the time to do it.
Are you registered to vote?
I'm going to say apply to register.
One prospective voter we visited recently, Anthony Wilson, sees this election as a way to exercise a right in an environment where so many other rights are restricted.
It's a double-edged sword, being incarcerated, but also having the freedom to vote.
Another voter, Adrian Pride, is hopeful that casting a ballot is an opportunity to make change.
Our word matters, just like everybody else. Just because we incarcerated doesn't mean we ain't equal. We ain't citizens of the United States, I was born here, Just made a mistake, that's all.
Today's election show for incarcerated listeners is playing on public radio stations across the state in collaboration with Illinois Public Radio, so people in correctional facilities all over can tune in. It's part of our Democracy Solutions Project, examining critical issues facing our country ahead of November 5th. For the next hour, we'll give you an overview of where the presidential candidates stand on criminal justice issues. And we'll hear about efforts to restore the right to vote for people serving time in prisons. But first, what does civic responsibility look like behind prison bars when you don't have the right to vote? To find out, let's introduce our first guest, Brian Beals. Now, he was wrongfully imprisoned for 35 years for a crime he didn't commit. While inside various prisons in Illinois, Beals taught civics education classes for people who would soon be released. He's now the director of the Chicago nonprofit Mud Theater Project, and he joins us now to share his expertise with us. Welcome to Reset, Brian.
Thank you, Sasha.
Good to see you. So you were in prison for 35 years, as I mentioned. You were exonerated just last December. So over the years, elections, presidents, senators, congressmen and women, they came and went. And you weren't allowed to vote for any of it. Did it ever feel to you like you were missing out?
Yeah, especially in the most important elections or historic elections, like when Obama was elected. I really wanted an opportunity to vote and have my voice heard.
Take me back to that moment, right? You're seeing, what you can see on television, right? All of the press leading up to Obama's election, and you're unable to do anything about it.
Yeah, remember watching the scenes from Grant Park when his family walked out and just being really proud in the moment, seeing history take place, even from behind bars. It was a special moment.
What did you hear from other people who were incarcerated with you? Did they want to vote too?
Oh, yes. Politics is a mainstay conversation behind bars. We all engage in civic discourse, and many of us want to talk about, who we support and what we support.
Yeah.
Yes.
Did they think that their vote mattered in the grand scheme of things? I want to hear more about the conversations that were happening inside.
Yeah, I think there's this yearning to vote because around election time, like this time of year, you get so much information and you see all the things on CNN and Fox, and people, we're talking about it because this is the topic of the day. And yeah, people really want to vote and be a part of the democracy that America represents.
And there's a lot of confusion as well as misinformation when it comes to voting eligibility for people getting out of prison. Clear that up for us, Brian. When and how can you vote if you've had a felony conviction?
So immediately, once you release from Illinois Department of Corrections, you're immediately eligible to vote. All you have to do is register. And one of them things that we did with civic education was make sure that everybody was informed of their right.
Did you feel like people inside knew what their rights were, or was there a lot of work for you to do?
I know. Honestly, people didn't know. And, it was a lot of ambiguity to people thought like in many different states you have felony restrictions and people just assume you had those same restrictions here in Illinois. So I'm really grateful that the civics program was put together to help clear that up.
You taught civics classes inside prison. Now, this was to really help them be prepared for when they would be released. The classes were mandated by a state law, which was actually drafted by men incarcerated at Stateville Prison. I want to play a little clip from one of the authors, Mike Simmons, who's now inside Sheridan Prison, which is about 70 miles west of Chicago.
We need people to be thinking civically engaged and civically minded, starting here. That way when we get outside, this is actually in the interest of justice and public safety. You know, the way we think leads us to where we're going in the decisions we're going to make.
Tell me more about how the civics classes came about.
So you are correct. They were put together by a group of incarcerated people at the think tank at Stateville, and Dr. Rivers and Chicago Lawyers Association and Chicago Votes. They got the law passed. Governor Pritzker signed it, and almost immediately started training guys in different institutions around the state to start teaching the class.
And so what were the main lessons that you were teaching in the classroom?
So we start out, it's broken down into 3 sections. The first section is a historic overview of voting that teaches you and demonstrates why it's very important. You need to learn about just how difficult it was for people to get the right to vote.
Right.
And that information kind of like feeds the mind. It's like, okay, you know, this is something that's very important because you go back, you examine pre-colonial times when, you know, you had government reactions to people coming together trying to get their rights. And we talk about what disenfranchisement means, felony disenfranchisement, all the way into like women's suffrage, Jim Crow. We do this timeline that explains all that, and it really fuels people's interest.
Oh, so you take them back with a history lesson too.
Yeah, that's the beginning. First, we start with the history, and then we get into like modern day politics a little bit.
What did you want them to come away with, really?
Just understanding just how important this right is, and you know, just the fight to get the right to vote. You know, many people are surprised that in the beginning of the country, at the onset of the Constitution, that only white males could vote who were 21 years of age, and generally they had to be Christian and landowners. So a lot of people were excluded. So, you know, now that everyone, after all these fights, after all the, you know, challenges to overcome, you know, the restrictions on voting, let's step up, incarcerated people, when we get out and make sure that our voices are heard.
Well, keeping that in mind, I mean, were there any topics that you covered in the civics classes, Brian, that you think particularly galvanized people and got them excited about participating in government?
The number one thing that we talked about that galvanized people was taxes. Everyone's interested in knowing how,
Oh, of course.
how their money is being spent and how much money is, you know, where it's going. They have this part of the course that talks about itemized, like what the government prioritized with your money, and we would discuss it. Like at the top of the list for the federal is defense, and all the way down the list at the, you know, near the bottom is education. And people would be like, wait a minute, I think education should be at least on par with, you know, defense, and, you know, have all these conversations based around those 2 topics and every other topic in between.
What other questions did the students ask in the classroom?
Well, I mean, you know, usually the facilitators would just spark interest. We would talk about the difference between what the state would do and what the federal government would do with the money. And then when we got to the part about public safety, you know, and people were like, wait a minute, I'm paying for my own incarceration. Well, people are, you know, I'm contributing to it. I should have a voice in what it looks like and how the money is
You saw
spent.
the wheels turning in their heads, like, wait a minute.
Definitely. And guys are really surprised, you know, to find out that in Illinois, we actually vote on judges. And when you're incarcerated, judges are a very important subject.
Absolutely, yeah. If you're just tuning in, this is Reset. I'm Sasha Ann Simons, and you're listening to a special collaboration with WBEZ's Prisoncast project. We're discussing what civic engagement means if you are sitting behind bars. Our guest in studio is Brian Beals, who's director of the nonprofit Mud Theater Project and a former civics education instructor for people inside prison. This was while he was also incarcerated. So let me read part of a message that we got from Kareem at Graham Correctional Center downstate. It says, quote, I would like to bring awareness to how imperative it is to cast our votes, not just on the federal level, but also on the state and local level. So this brings us back to the point you just raised, Brian, because there's a category of local races on the ballot this fall, which is the judges, right? That's a huge piece, you know, and since people inside may have had direct interactions with some of the judges who are up for retention, Tell me more about what you talked about in the civics class with them.
Well, we talked about those judges that are actually elected, and then those judges that are appointed by elected judges, and the difference between, like, I think there's a lot of conversation, like, judges who aren't elected seem to sentence harder. And we were, really, that was a big topic of conversation, but also just the whole point of local government about how important it is, even in off elections, in between midterm elections, how important it is for us to have our voices heard in local communities that we come from. And guys really get, fired up about, I should really take advantage of that when I get out.
Right. And you said that some of them didn't even know that judges were up for election, right?
I mean, it's not something that's generally talked about, when we coming through grammar school, and a lot of guys inside, unfortunately, don't finish high school. And you get the education, you need to understand that. So, unfortunately, we have the civics education program to re-engage and re-instruct.
So, Brian, if you had the right to vote while you were inside, what do you think would have changed for you, like for your perspective or your experience in prison?
Well, first off, politicians would have really had to pay attention to the conditions on the side, because you think about being downstate in small rural areas where most of the prisons are located. We could have had a big voice in those local elections, and that means people would have had to really come inside and caught up our vote, and we'd have had a voice in what happens in terms of reform and the balance of spending between security and reform on the inside. And when people started to realize that, it's like, okay, yeah, this is how democracy is supposed to work.
Right. There's a lot of people listening to us right now who haven't taken these classes yet. What's your message to folks on this issue?
Yeah, right now, the way the program is set up, that you have to be, close to going home within 6 months of going home to get to class. But we're pushing and striving with Chicago Votes to make it where everyone can take the class. That it's not like a set aside for best people going home, because politics matter, and a lot of times people on the inside are a source of information for their family, particularly in the communities that we come from, and just being civically engaged and having different level conversations with siblings or children is important.
Yeah, it's funny how you say that. They're inside and they're the source of information for a lot of their families.
Yes.
Yet they're limited as to what they can do.
Limited to what you can do, but also, you're able to read more, you're able to study more, you're able to examine some of the things that the speed of life out here,
right,
takes away from you.
So you talked earlier about just the moment of Barack Obama's presidency and how that sort of caught your attention and inspired you to want to make your own voice heard. Tell us about the last time you voted before you were incarcerated.
It was similarly situated. I voted for Harold Washington. I remember growing up in Inglewood, and he came to 63rd Street Concourse, and the entire 63rd Street was filled with people, young guys like me. We were climbing street poles just to get a chance to see him. And because the mayor of Chicago has such a large impact on work and jobs, you almost felt it immediately, Unfortunately, I was incarcerated wrongfully before I had a chance to vote again, but seeing the impact that Harold Washington had on our community and the city was very exciting at the time.
How did it feel to know that you were part of that?
I felt a little bit, kind of like pop my collar a little bit. Like, yeah, I played a role in that even as a young man.
It was empowering still.
Very empowering.
Despite your circumstance.
Yes.
Have you voted yet in the upcoming election, or are you planning to head to the polling place and cast your ballot on November 5th?
Well, I voted earlier when I got out in the primary, so now, I'm planning to go with my sister and vote. She's getting up in age, so I really have a good time going with her and hearing her opinions when we're in the car, driving there, and talking about who we support, who she supports versus who I support.
Putting together your game plan on the way.
The plan, yeah.
Yeah.
And what her interests are as a homeowner, and mine as just someone freshly released, trying to get to that level.
It's a long time coming, right? So what do you anticipate that experience is going to be like for you? Right now we've got a pretty unprecedented election, right?
Yes.
You've got two candidates up here that, a lot of talk right now. So what will that be like for you to make your voice heard in this particular election?
Well, it's going to come full circle, going from being an instructor inside for many years and now actually having an opportunity to participate and make my voice heard. But it's probably going to be a little emotional, Hopefully we get the right outcome, the one that I want. So, yeah, I'm really looking forward to it.
That's Brian Beals. He was wrongfully convicted and while in prison, led classes to teach civic engagement to fellow incarcerated people. Thank you so much for making the time for us today.
And thank you, Sasha.
Now, still to come, what issues do people who are incarcerated care about this election season? A national survey asked, and the answers may surprise you. We're going to dig into those responses up next. That's just ahead on this NPR station. This is Reset. I'm Sasha Ann Simons. Today we're partnering with WBEZ's Prisoncast and with public radio stations around Illinois to bring you a special election-themed show for people in the state's prisons and jails. The Marshall Project, a newsroom that covers the criminal justice system, recently surveyed incarcerated people across the country and asked for their thoughts on the November election. More than 54,000 people responded, including more than 1,000 in Illinois. And what they said might surprise you. Here to explain is Nicole Lewis, an engagement editor for the Marshall Project. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us, what kinds of questions did you send to people inside?
Yeah, we wanted to know, who they would pick if they could vote for president. We wanted to know if they thought Kamala Harris was qualified for the job. We asked them questions about what political party do they identify with, whether or not they see themselves as Democrats, Republicans, or independents. We asked questions that allowed us to compare their responses with the responses of people on the outside.
And just so we're clear, Nicole, in Illinois, people in jail awaiting trial, they maintain their right to vote. People who are in prison are the ones who can't vote, at least until they serve their sentence and they're released. But the rules vary by state. Now, if incarcerated people could vote, who have they said that they'd support in the presidential election?
Yeah, if everyone behind bars could vote, right? If the sort of franchise was open to them, overwhelmingly, our respondents said that they would vote for Trump. And we see some really important demographic trends there. So white men really prefer Trump as their candidate. But a large share of black men said that they would vote for Trump too if they had the chance.
Now, in a few moments, we're going to bring in one of your colleagues to hear more about where Donald Trump and Kamala Harris stand on issues affecting people inside. But first, I want to play some tape here of incarcerated men who registered to vote inside Cook County Jail. Here they are explaining who they support and why.
I'm voting for Trump, even though he's an asshole. He keeps it 100. He let everybody know what's going on with the world.
Harris, she a Democrat, and I feel like she better off than Trump.
Donald Trump, because he kick ass. I just feel like, he more for the people than the rest of presidentials who trying to step up and want us to elect on them.
It's time for a change. Just like Harris said, she's a good candidate. Donald Trump, he let me down last time.
So, Nicole, what are some other things that you heard from people in Illinois about why they support one candidate over the other? I mean, that tape just kind of made pretty plain what you said a moment ago. A lot of people are supporting Trump.
Yeah, I think in some ways people told us that they identify with the president. He has 34 felony convictions, and so people are, they see more of themselves in him than they can see in some of the other candidates. The perception is that he's really been influential on criminal justice reform, where the Democrats have fallen short.
Something WBEZ has been hearing during our regular visits to Cook County Jail is that jail is kind of an information desert, right? And this is, of course, part of the reason why we're doing this program. People say they can't get enough background on the races, and they feel like they can't cast an informed vote. I want to play a little sound from Isaiah Hudson, who we met at Cook County.
Everything's pretty much word of mouth. What we hear from our families, what we hear from staff, that's pretty much it. We see a little bit on TV, but we don't always have the opportunity to watch TV, of course.
So what are you hearing about, what information access is like in prisons and jails?
Yeah, in many ways, access to information is actually the key issue here. So many folks have told us in prison as well as in jail that the news is censored. They don't have enough access to create opinions of their own, right? And you heard that in this clip, that word of mouth and what people are talking about influences so much of people's ideas and their thinking. Mm-hmm. And some people expressed a sense of isolation, right? That they want to be able to drill down and develop their own thoughts, but they just really don't have that access.
Another topic that you asked about in your survey is what kind of punishment do people think Donald Trump should face for his own conviction on 34 felony counts? So what did you hear on that?
Yeah, we found a number of things. I'd say by and large, our respondents were much more willing to be lenient towards the president than folks on the outside, right? And so we can see that in comparison polls. But then there was this huge division based on how you identified. So Republicans who responded to our survey mostly said, we think Donald Trump should be fined. That's plenty enough punishment for what he's done. Democrats, on the other hand, were much more likely to say, we actually think Donald Trump should be incarcerated. He has 34 felony convictions. You know, we would be incarcerated. And so there was a certain kind of pragmatism that emerged in a lot of their responses about what they'd choose. Many folks said, you know, prison and jail actually hasn't done anything for me, and it wouldn't do anything for the president. Or prison and jail is so harmful that we actually wouldn't want to see another person sent here, even if it is Donald Trump. And then other folks said, you know, folks who are more inclined to incarcerate the president said, well, actually, if it were me with 34 felonies, I'd be in prison forever. So why should he get special treatment, or why should we go easier on him? You know, status, money, wealth, fame actually shouldn't get you special treatment in this system.
And Nicole, for people listening who might still be unsure, why is it important to have this kind of snapshot of how incarcerated people are thinking about politics?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. The majority of people behind bars will return home one day. So it really matters what they think, right? Because we don't have an understanding of when all these folks come back, like, what does that mean for them? I'd say the other big thing, you know, I've reported on felony disenfranchisement for the Marshall Project for years, and I always heard, you know, presidential candidates, other candidates simply do not campaign in communities with high rates of incarceration. They say these are communities where people don't vote, they don't show up, we're not going to prioritize any time. And I think our survey makes really, really clear a couple of things. Number one, that there is a broad political spectrum behind bars. So that means that conservative candidates, right, have constituents who are incarcerated. I think that's really important to know. But it also means that any candidate, right, who can think about policies that would actually move the needle, that would actually touch folks who are in this position, have a potential base of support, right? So just spending the time really thinking about the issues that matter here, right, is an opportunity for more voters.
And thinking differently about your outreach.
That's exactly right. And maybe just one last thing, right? So I think it's obviously tremendously important. The criminal justice system affects so many people. It affects many more people than who are incarcerated, right? So we can see that about half of all Americans have a loved one who's been in lockup of some kind. And about 79 million people have a criminal record of some kind. So when we talk about incarcerated voters, who they're connected to, right, that's a huge share of people who actually do still have access to voting.
Right.
So just to take it back, that like prisons and jails are much more porous than we give them credit for being. So this is not just an issue that affects people behind bars, it really affects all of us.
We've been speaking with Nicole Lewis, an engagement editor for the Marshall Project, about their political survey of people in prisons and jails. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.
Now let's bring in one of her colleagues. Jamiles Lartey is a staff writer at the Marshall Project. He's here to provide an inside look into the presidential candidates' own relationships with the criminal justice system and where they stand on issues that directly impact people who are in prisons. Welcome to the show, Jamiles.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So have either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump weighed in on issues around prisons specifically, like sentencing reform or prison conditions?
Frankly, no. And it's a dramatic shift in some ways from, certainly the Democratic primary of 2019 into 2020, when criminal justice reform was really kind of hot, almost you could say, and it was a way for candidates to distinguish themselves. So I think in 2024, there are a lot of topics that kind of touch on criminal justice issues, whether it's debates over immigration or the general framing of the election as one between a prosecutor and a convicted felon. So I don't want to suggest that criminal justice is absent from this campaign, but in terms of policy questions about, how should we do sentencing, or what should the rules be about solitary confinement, or how should police be trained? That just hasn't been part of the 2024 campaign to this point.
I want to back up a little bit then and talk about each candidate's personal experiences with the criminal justice system and what we know about how that's shaped their views. Kamala Harris worked as prosecutor and was San Francisco's district attorney and California's attorney general. Can you remind us, Jamiles, what was her record like?
Yeah, I mean, Kamala Harris, her experience with the criminal justice system comes primarily as an elected prosecutor in San Francisco and as the state attorney general of California. In both roles, she's tasked with enforcing criminal law, and she's often described her time in those roles as working on behalf of the victims of crime, especially violent crimes and crimes against women. She was involved in efforts over that time that put her in the company of criminal justice reformers, like the Back on Track diversion program that she spearheaded. And that was on the earlier side of the emergence of programs like that. She was also involved in programs that I think would be seen today as embodying a quote unquote tough on crime mindset, like efforts to reduce school truancy that put the prospect of arresting parents for children's school absences on the table. Although the cases where that actually happened were extremely few and there were other officials and policies in play.
Donald Trump's been convicted of multiple felonies. Do we have a sense of whether that shapes his views on the criminal justice system?
He's frequently spoken about the system as being rigged or unfair, or these cases as a politicized effect to target him. And in that, I would say he's occupying a space that's fairly unique in American politics to date. On the one hand, he's been aggressively, quote unquote, tough on crime. He's embraced a law and order persona, speaking derisively about criminal defendants and often bombastically about the problem of crime, sometimes in misleading and incorrect ways. But he's also expressed quite a bit of skepticism about the criminal justice system, going after the judges and prosecutors who've been involved in the cases where he's been on trial.
How much of an impact can the president have on the criminal justice system?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's important, anytime we're having this conversation, to understand that most of our criminal justice system does not happen at the federal level, and the president doesn't have a ton of control over how most laws get enforced.
Right.
They're mostly state laws that are enforced by county level or city level officials.
So taking into account that limited power that you just described, I mean, what kinds of policies did we see Trump enact when he was president?
Right. So that being said, Trump's criminal justice background during the 4 years he was president are kind of mixed. I mean, on the one hand, he did sign an executive order after the killing of George Floyd that at least proposed to make some minor changes to policing. He also quite infamously signed the First Step Act, which was the first major piece of bipartisan criminal justice reform legislation that we'd seen in decades in this country, and has since led to the release of over 40,000 federal prisoners since its implementation. On the other side of that coin, Trump fueled a national execution binge towards the end of his term. He made our nation's immigration system far more punitive. He deployed federal law enforcement in some fairly novel ways during the summer of 2020. And I also think it's just worth, I mean, we're talking about the past, but it's probably just worth pausing here to mention that he's also promised in a second term to mobilize the military in cities to fight crime, and a number of other really unprecedented proposals around criminal justice.
Right. Harris currently serves as vice president, and her power is even more limited. So talk to us about what the Biden administration has done on criminal justice issues.
Yeah, so I mean, earlier I just mentioned that the president doesn't have much power over the criminal justice system. One caveat there, like one thing that the president definitely can do, is directly set the policies and procedures for federal law enforcement, like the FBI, the DEA, the U.S. Marshals, organizations like that. So that's something that the Biden administration has used its power to do. It put in restrictions around the use of no-knock warrants by federal officials. They changed rules around federal officials wearing body cameras. They changed the use of force standards to get rid of what people colloquially probably know as chokeholds. Biden also signed a bipartisan bill to increase oversight of federal prisons just earlier this summer. Like Trump, Biden also has been fairly limited in his use of clemency to pardon or shorten the sentences of federal prisoners. And yeah, I mean, to the kind of thrust of the question, it's really not terribly clear where a theoretical President Harris would pick up on these efforts in her first term.
That's Jamiles Larte, who's a staff writer at the Marshall Project. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was great to be with you.
Still to come, the push to restore the right to vote for people currently behind bars. That's just ahead on this NPR station. And we're back now with more Reset. I'm your host, Sasha Ann Simons, and you're listening to a special collaboration with WBEZ's Prisoncast project, all about the election from the perspective of people currently and formerly incarcerated in Illinois. When we visited prisons and jails ahead of this program, there was one issue people like Dwayne McCoy kept talking about.
I would like to have a voice in who my president would be for my kids, for my daughter. So that's why I think civil engagement and voting for people in prison is very important.
Most people in Illinois jails can vote because they haven't yet been convicted. But when you're serving a sentence in prison, Illinois is one of 48 states that revokes your right to vote. Now, there's a movement in the works to change that. Joining us now to discuss is Jimmy Soto. He spent 42 years in prison in Illinois before being exonerated. In a new federal lawsuit, he's suing Chicago and the police for $200 million. Welcome to the program, Jimmy.
Thank you for having me.
Also with us is Christina Rivers, professor of political science at DePaul University and coordinator of the DePaul think tank inside Stateville Prison. Good to have you here, Professor.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
And rounding out our panel is Frederique Desrosiers, policy manager with the group Chicago Votes. Welcome, Frederique.
Thank you so much for having me.
Professor, I want to start with you, and I want to start with a question that we heard from a few people inside, like Joe Stack, who's at Sheridan Prison, west of Chicago, wonders why people with felony convictions lose their right to vote in the first place. So can you just give us a brief history lesson?
Sure. These laws have deep roots. They go back to the ancient Greek democracy, where the perception was, the idea was that those who committed harm against society would essentially temporarily lose what they refer to as their civic personhood as part of their punishment. To my knowledge, these were never permanent punishments, and they were never really that pervasive. This concept of felony disenfranchisement made its way up to the colonies. Here in the U.S., were embedded into most state laws, and they really proliferated in the South after the Civil War during the Jim Crow era and became one of the most effective methods of suppressing the black vote in the South as they worked in tandem with the criminal legal systems in those areas.
Jimmy, why do you believe it's important for people who are incarcerated to have the right to vote?
Well, for one, we're counted in the census, and they use that as a way to get funding and other programs, whatever district the prison may be in. But we have no voice in it. We're locked out. We're excluded. And I think it's important because so much of the legal system affects our everyday life.
You know, as we mentioned, 48 states don't allow people in prisons to vote. And I can imagine that some people listening right now might think disenfranchisement is one of the known consequences that you face if you're convicted of a felony. What is your response to that, Professor?
I think my immediate response is there's still so much misinformation. Some seems to be mindful, others not, just about the right to vote and voter eligibility in this country.
What do people get wrong?
That felony disenfranchisement is uniformly permanent across the U.S. In fact, it's a real patchwork of laws. Different states, because of the 10th Amendment, can handle this in different ways. There's nothing in the Constitution compelling these laws. And so there's as much variety in voter disenfranchisement and gaining re-eligibility across the states. And so it's really easy to get that confused from state to state. What stands out to me the most is there's misinformation and misunderstanding, in my experience, across economic sectors, across people, depending on, I've had conversations about this in rooms full of people with PhDs in political science. So there's a real pervasive lack of information around these laws, both in terms of how they exist, but also how they started.
So we talked to someone who's currently incarcerated, Talib McDonald, in Sheridan Prison, who argues that re-enfranchising people in prison, which is giving them the right to vote, might reduce recidivism.
How can someone be restored to useful citizenship if they're not allowed to operate as citizens? So if you got someone incarcerated, a captured audience, so to speak, This is the perfect time to teach them. This is your responsibility. And once you start getting people to think responsibly, then maybe they'll start to act responsibly.
Frederic, I see you nodding your head there. Give us your thoughts on what Talib had to say.
Yeah, I think he's exactly right. I think that the idea of restoring the right to vote to people who are incarcerated connects them with their community, right? And so if you are a part of your community, you see yourself as a part of a community, you're less likely to harm your community. We know that people who are incarcerated still have connections. Most people who are incarcerated will go back to their communities. They're not going to be there forever. They have a stake in it, whether they have kids, family members, about what they want to see when they return. And so I think he's exactly right. People who feel connected to their community are less likely to harm others and less likely to go back to prison.
If you're just tuning in, this is Reset. I'm Sasha Ann Simons, and we are partnering with WBEZ's Prisoncast project and with public radio stations across Illinois. We're talking about the push to restore voting rights to people in prison with Jimmy Soto, who's one of the longest-serving exonerees in Illinois history, Christina Rivers, who's a DePaul political science professor, and Frederic Desrosiers, who is with the group Chicago Votes. So, Frederico, I want to hear more from people in prison. Patrice, who's in Joliet, asked about the status of legislative efforts focused on allowing voting from prison. I know that you have lobbied in Springfield trying to bring awareness to the issue. So tell us more about what you heard from politicians.
Yeah, throughout Illinois, there is a lot of legislators who support this. They want to see this happen. There is a lot of pushback from more of the moderate Democrats who I think are concerned about politically what it will look like in their district. But this legislation has been going on in different forms for many years. Chicago Votes has been working on it since 2021. The closest we got to passing the legislation was also in 2021, where the bill fell short, about 3 votes needed to pass to the next chamber. So we have different iterations that come out every time the session ends. Currently, we're working on a bill, the Reintegration and Civic Empowerment Act, also known as the RACE Act, that would expand civics education in prison. I'm sure we'll talk about that, and Brian talked about it a little bit as well. It will also restore voting rights to people who are incarcerated.
Go ahead and tell us more now.
Yeah, so basically what that bill does is it relocates the civics courses that Brian talked about to the beginning of people's sentences. Before, it was only available for folks who, towards the end of their sentence, so it would make that available for everybody. We considered it would still be peer taught. And it would also have reenfranchisement language that would allow people who are incarcerated in Illinois to get their right to vote back after a short period of disenfranchisement, which is required by our Illinois Constitution.
Right.
But it's not defined on how long that period has to be, which makes the Illinois legislature have the authority to restore it earlier if they choose. And so we're hoping that they will choose that and pass the bill.
Interesting. So, Jimmy, right now, what do you see as the biggest obstacle in this push to give incarcerated people the right to vote?
I think it's educating the public. A lot of the public, like Professor Rivers pointed out, have a misunderstanding of what really the disenfranchisement is all about, because what it really is judicially made. Our Constitution, our state Constitution in Article 1, Section 11 says they have to restore the offender to useful citizen. As Talib alluded to, you're taking that away. You're not making me into a useful citizen if you exclude me out of the process of voting. So I think that civic engagement is important to make the person whole again, because so much of the system makes you dehumanized, and this is a way of giving you back your personhood. I don't think it should be that way, and people think it's, like she said, universal, and it's not.
So, Professor, realistically, I mean, is this something that you see happening anytime soon?
Yes. I think we're getting close here in Illinois, and I'm really, really proud of Chicago Votes and of our incarcerated partners at Stateville and elsewhere who have really been helping to push for this type of this law. One thing I wanted to point out, and I know, Jimmy, you wanted to get to this as well, but related to the misinformation, which I think is getting better now, but we still need to do a lot more yelling from the rooftops, is that, the U.S. is seen and puts itself out there as the first modern democracy, right? But we're the only one of our peer democracies that automatically disenfranchises people as part of a felony conviction, besides the UK. And of course, we come out of that system. So we're really an outlier as a leading democracy in the amount of people that we disenfranchise, because in part we're an outlier in that we we incarcerate more people than most of our Democratic allies. And so I think that's a piece of information that really, really needs to be put out there, is this is a way in which we stand out in a way that runs counter to our commitments to democracy and to equality, for that matter.
Your thoughts, Frederic, on the obstacles in the way of getting us to having incarcerated people have the right to vote?
I would say that there's a lot of stigma and public perception that needs to change. I think that we can tend to see voting as a privilege instead of a right that everyone should have. I think that there is also just kind of, in some ways, a lack of political will from lawmakers who I think need to see this as more of an extension of this is the next vestige of the civil rights movement. People who are incarcerated are the last remaining group of disenfranchised people in Illinois, and I think that if we're serious about righting the wrongs of racial injustice in the past, that they would be willing to take this step.
So you have called the right to vote in prisons a racial justice issue and a women's issue. And the head of Illinois Environmental Council has also called this an environmental issue. Explain, Frederic, how can it be all of those things?
Well, for a racial justice issue, as Dr. Rivers alluded to, we see a lot of these felony disenfranchisement laws pop up after the 15th Amendment, 13th, 14th Amendment, that gave political power to Black people. And so we see in Illinois in 1870, the same year that the 15th Amendment was passed, is the first time we see these kind of laws pop up in Illinois. It's also a women's issue for a number of reasons. 80% of women who are incarcerated are mothers. They should have a right to vote on the decisions and the lawmakers that affect their children, like school boards, things like that. It's also an environmental issue. I think almost every single prison in Illinois has failed the clean drinking water test. There was outbreaks of Legionella in prison. Just so many different environmental impacts and terrible prison conditions that are allowed to perpetuate because people in prison don't have any elected officials that they can hold accountable through voting.
Right. Yeah. People in prisons are subjected to pollution and poor air and water quality. But as you said, Frederic, can't elect lawmakers to do anything about it. From your perspective, Jimmy, how do the results of elections like this upcoming one affect incarcerated people directly?
I think it directly affects them because of the appointment of justices by the president, and it also affects them by the elections of the judges. Like, for example, in Cook County, we probably have a good maybe 15 judges that were ranked poor by the Illinois Bar Association. But the public, again, is not educated on that. And that directly affects someone trying to put in some type of collateral petition. And then, of course, at the federal level, the federal justices, they're the gateway to our federal habeas corpus relief and or our 1983 civil complaints about conditions, et cetera. So that's how it directly affects us.
What comes to mind for you on that one, Professor? The direct impact.
We don't have enough time in the day. I'm going to come at that question a little bit differently because I've been thinking about this as we've been talking. And in some cases, the momentum is there with respect to civic engagement on the part of people with a felony conviction that we don't hear about. And so as you were talking, I was thinking of how important it is that we know that this law that we are now seeking to adjust, the Reentering Citizens Civic Engagement Act, was written by incarcerated people. This was their idea. It was written at Stateville Prison, and it has worked and is working well. And I'm learning more that there are many other acts of civic engagement, legislative activity across the state by people who are incarcerated or by people who were incarcerated. And these are laws that are largely around equality, whether it has to do with criminal laws or voting rights or conditions, in some cases in labor laws. Indiana Women's Prison has a really good legacy of writing local laws related to labor. So a lot of this is already happening. And so it really flies in the face of both scholarly and public notions that people with a felony conviction, whether they're currently serving their sentence or not, are politically apathetic. And so that might not be the direct answer to your question, but it's what I was thinking about as we've been having this discussion, and I really want to put that out there.
Important thought. Another man at Sheridan, Carrell Weeks, suggests voting could be a part of rehabilitation.
I didn't know how important voting was until I understand what accountability was. And that was only by recognizing the pain that I caused another family. You understand? So I believe voting is important, not only for my own family, but to just show that we are people. We have hearts just like anybody else have a heart, to want protection and everything else.
Jimmy, now that you have been exonerated and released, how do you think about politics and voting ahead of November 5th?
I think it reinforces the idea of freedom and democracy, because in there, like I said, we were excluded from having the right to vote. And so now I can exercise that right, and it lets me know that I am free. I am able to go in there and, check the ballot who I want to see elected.
Yeah. We heard from a lot of people inside who couldn't vote but talked to their families about voting. While the fight for reenfranchisement continues, what are ways that people inside can make their voices heard in the meantime?
As Professor Rivers pointed out, we took the initiative to try to formulate legislation. For example, with Parole Illinois and the PNAP, the Prison Neighborhood Arts Project, we had a think tank. There was a DePaul think tank, and we collaborated to come up with our own legislation to say we need parole back in Illinois. And so that's a part of being involved in the electoral process, by going to the legislators. And they would come in, and oftentimes they left educated by us as opposed to them bringing a message to us.
Quick last word from you, Frederick.
I would just want to highlight all the amazing work that people have done for this legislation and for this work from inside a prison up until the closure of Stateville last month. They have been consulting and leading on this work, and we are just the arms on the outside. So just want to thank them for all of their contribution and know that we're doing this because of their work.
That's Frederic Desrosiers, who's policy manager with the group Chicago Votes, Jimmy Soto, who's one of the longest-serving exonerees in Illinois history. And we've also been talking with DePaul political science professor Christina Rivers. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
And that is it for this special edition of Reset. This episode was produced by Lauren Frost, Alex Keefe, and Meha Ahmed, with assistance from Ari Mejia. The Prisoncast project is funded by the Mellon Foundation. We'd like to send a big thank you to our partners at Illinois Public Radio stations statewide. If you'd like to get in touch, you can reach us at wbez.org/prisoncast. And if you're inside, send a letter to WBEZ Prisoncast, 848 East Grand Avenue, Chicago, Illinois, 60611. For more Reset, check out our podcast. That way you can take Reset with you on the go. Find us wherever you get your podcast. Just search WBEZ's Reset. I'm Sasha Ann Simons. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Have a good one, and we'll meet again very soon.